Hey, deserving listeners, this is Chapter 9 in our deep dive on the psychology of Josh Powell. Let me give a quick recap to bring you up to speed. So in December of 2009, Susan disappears. Josh's alibi doesn't make any sense, and there's a mountain of circumstantial evidence, and the press and the internet and the police all agree that Josh did it. But Josh basically gets away with it. Regardless, Josh and his father, Stephen, keep yammering to the press, and because of this, in 2011, about a year and a half later, Stephen's house is raided in Puyallup, Washington, near Seattle, even though Susan disappeared in Utah because Josh moved up to the Seattle area. And the police find a mountain of evidence showing that Stephen is an absolute monster. I've already been over this. This is when they discover all the details about his obsession and his crimes on Susan. Josh's kids are temporarily placed away from Josh and with Susan's parents, the Coxes, because Josh was living with Stephen, so it calls into question Josh's capacity and judgment as a parent. My friend and colleague, Dr. Jim Manley, evaluates Josh's parenting as a clinical forensic psychologist. Jim conducts those tests and observes Josh's parenting in person. He submits his report to the court, and in brief summary, the report basically says that Josh is a good enough parent. Aside from some minor issues that should be addressed, Josh is a good enough parent, and therefore the recommendation is that Josh should be given custody again of Charlie and Braden. So at this point, in late 2011, about 2 years after Susan disappeared, everyone assumes that Josh is going to get his kids back, and in all likelihood, Josh was quite pleased with what had been happening in the courts, and he was probably quite pleased with how he managed to pass this parenting evaluation. And Josh probably thought that after getting the kids back, things would go a lot easier for him, because even though he was continuing to be attacked, because everyone assumed that he killed Susan, there was a lot more attention on Stephen right now because of the treasure trove of data and evidence that the police had found and were starting to talk about. So I'm guessing that Josh was quite optimistic moving into February of 2012. However, in late January 2012, something happens that changes everything. Okay, so let's get into this. The Utah police in late January 2012, they send to the Washington police some new evidence. And that evidence consists of 400 images of cartoon incest, like Bart and Marge having sex, that kind of thing. And the Utah cops tell the Washington cops that they found these images on Josh's computer. So this is a bombshell that goes off, and we have to back up in time so that I can tell you where these images came from. All right, so let's rewind the clock back to December 2009. Susan just disappeared. The police are investigating, and the Utah cops are sifting through a lot of evidence, and they got their hands on one of the laptops in the Powell household. They were digging through all the files, and they found these 400 images of cartoon incest on that laptop. So they found this all the way back in 2009. And why did it take that long to send that information over to the Washington police? Because the Washington police had been asking for all the information that they could get their hands on, because they were initially looking into Josh because of Susan, but also now that Stephen is being charged, this is relevant data. So when Josh lost custody of his kids, the police in Utah were monitoring everything that was happening in Washington. And they hear that there's a question about whether or not Josh is a capable parent, a safe parent. And so they say, okay, here's our chance to do something about this case, because they feel so powerless about what's been happening. They've been asking the prosecutor to charge, and the prosecutor isn't doing it. They haven't found the body. They haven't found the murderer. They're trying to do something, according to them, which I believe. And they say, okay, now's our chance. We can send these files to the cops in Washington, these 400 images. And apparently, they have to ask a judge to release this. I don't know how this works, but that's what the police have said. So they ask a judge, can we share these 400 images on a computer of Josh's, of child incest porn, to Washington State, because they are looking into whether or not Josh is a safe parent. The judge, apparently, according to the police, say that the pictures cannot be shared with Washington State unless the children were about to be given back to Josh. So you ask, why? Well, the pictures are considered to be contraband, illegal, which, okay, but it's cops talking to cops about a cop issue and a parenting issue. It's not like you're sharing files, like you're a teacher in a school and you found something on like a kid had something on them and you are just going to tweet about it. This is within the system. Don't cops talk to each other about illegal things? Don't they share evidence that is of an illegal nature? Because I just don't understand. So the judge says, no, you can't share this information because those pictures are illegal. I'm guessing I'm missing something, but the judge says, okay, but if Josh is about to get custody, then you can release it. Because I think maybe the judge thought Josh will never get custody back, which is kind of silly given the scenario. But anyway, so the other thing is that, the question mark as to whether or not Josh is a safe parent is one question. Another question, especially when you find the child porn, is Josh harming children in general, not only his own kids, but other kids, plus the visitation is happening. But anyway, so is Josh just a safe person in our society? That would be a question mark, right? That should be evaluated. And everyone needs all the information. The police in Washington need that information. So I don't understand why the only concern was, well, if he's going to get his kids back, then we'll see. I just don't get it. And I don't know if I'm reading into this. I'm not an expert, and I'm just cherry picking, or this is confirmation or whatever. But I think there might be something wrong with the Utah system. No offense to Utah people or people who work in the Utah system, but this year I've just been hearing a lot of horrible stories happening along these lines. We have the prosecutor that I've already been over in Utah. We have this judge, and maybe the judge and the prosecutor are in the right. I don't know. Neither have responded to requests for interviews. At least the prosecutor. I don't know about the judge, but anyway. We also have Ruby Franke and Jody Hildebrandt, if you remember that story. And one of the details that is stuck in my brain, and this is also in Utah, that you had many people calling CPS about Ruby Franke, and I'm pretty sure Jody Hildebrandt as well. At least I know for sure about Ruby Franke, and it wasn't just random people. It was people in Ruby Franke's own family. Ruby Franke's own sisters were calling CPS saying, you need to do something about the abuse that our sister is perpetrating on her children. Also, you had one of Ruby Franke's own children who eventually became an adult and moved out of the house, and then she started to report to CPS her own stories. She was there. For years, this has been happening. The reports, and CPS is doing nothing. The police are doing nothing. The system is doing nothing. It took a child, one of Ruby Franke's kids, to have been abused and tortured by the hands of Jody Hildebrandt, apparently. And Ruby Franke knew about at least some of this, if not all. It took that child to go through all that, and God knows what else, prior to that. And that child manages to bravely escape the torture by breaking the bonds of, their hands and feet are bound and they're being starved and not given water. And one of the kids escapes from the bonds, escapes through a window, dashes to a neighbor's house, and they call the police. There's wounds. The child is emaciated. And then the news story happens because now you have a witness, you have this neighbor, and you have the 911 call. Then the system did something. Now, the monsters here are Ruby Franke and Jody Hildebrandt, but when you have a system that is comprised, I'm guessing, of compassionate, normal humans, but they don't do something about that system to actually make it work in the way it's designed to work, then you have a system that is possibly an accomplice to these crimes. So I don't know. That's just two stories. We just have the Susan Powell story and the Jody Hildebrandt, Ruby Franke story. I'm sure if you cherry picked up some data from any state, you would find these kinds of stories. But I don't know. Does anyone know? But at the very least, I hope that the people involved have changed. There's also a matter of funding, because when you overload agencies, they simply just don't have the time or the brain space. So you can't necessarily blame the individuals on the ground. You can blame the taxpayers and the legislatures. Anyway, I don't know. But anyway, so since Josh was about to get custody because he passes this parenting evaluation, the police in Utah say, okay, Judge, can we hand over these 400 images that we've been sitting on for 2 years? And the judge says, yes, you are authorized to release those images of child porn on a computer of Josh's. So some of you might be wondering, well, isn't it a crime to have child porn on your computer? Well, apparently at the time in Washington State, I don't know about now, but at the time, it was not illegal to possess those kinds of images because they were cartoons, they're drawings. I don't know if it's considered art or it doesn't involve the exploitation of actual children in the images, I don't know, but it wasn't considered illegal, but it would raise questions about Josh's suitability as a parent, right? So that's why it was submitted. So at this point, my friend and colleague, Dr. Jim Manley, was informed about the pornography because it's additional information about the parenting evaluation. So Jim calls Josh to set up another interview. Jim interviews Josh about these pictures. And in that interview, Josh says that he's never seen these pictures. And Josh threw out a speculation that a house guest might have come into the house, used the computer, and downloaded those pictures without his knowledge. So at this point, no one believes Josh, right, including Jim. But, Jim's trying to be a partial, objective evaluator, so he includes those statements in the addendum to his report, because he's already submitted his report saying Josh is a good enough parent with some minor issues, like going to therapy for some minor narcissism issues and overbearingness as a parent, but it's low grade, that kind of thing. And he's like, okay, addendum. And so now this addendum is being sent to the court. And let's get to that hearing, that court hearing. But first, let's take a break. All right, we're back from the break. So we are now at February 1, 2012. It's a Wednesday, and keep that in mind because that is relevant in a bit. There's a hearing. It's, I think, an emergency hearing for the addendum, and Jim submits this new report at the hearing, and Jim recommends that Josh participate in a psychosexual evaluation by a sex offender treatment provider, a specialist in sex offenders. So it's a psychosexual evaluation. And in the report, quote, Jim says, the reviewed images indicate someone's fantasy-laden view of having sex with children. This is not a healthy parenting perception. End of quote. So a psychosexual evaluation typically involves, so at this point, no one knows what the psychosexual specialist will do. the sex offender treatment provider will conduct an initial assessment and then will have a certain procedure to the evaluation. But typically, what it involves is a plethysmograph, a polygraph, and interviews and testing. But let's focus on the plethysmograph and the polygraph test. So the plethysmograph, which is both a word that is difficult to say but kind of fun to say. I don't know what that says about me, but plethysmograph. So what a plethysmograph usually involves is a measuring device is placed on the genitals of the subject to measure arousal while images are shown to the subject. This is a rough test regarding whether or not someone is turned on by something. So, for example, if you have a guy who is suspected of being attracted to minors, but he's claiming that he's not, and it's relevant to a case, then the subject might volunteer or might be subjected involuntarily to this test in which a loop is placed around the penis, and then the individual, the subject, is shown images and they measure arousal. And through this method, then they can have a rough estimate regarding what someone's attraction involves. So the other thing, typically in a psychosexual evaluation, is a polygraph test, which I'm sure you've all seen those on TV, a lie detector test. And so that's typically involved. So at this point, since this deep dive is about the psychology of Josh Powell, we can enter into Josh's shoes, if you care to. He was almost to the finish line, and then the Utah police send over this random bit of data and evidence, and all of a sudden everything turns on its head, and everyone is now going, what's up with this guy? And he is now being subjected to this pretty invasive evaluation. Was he worried about the plethysmograph test? Was he worried about the polygraph? Was he worried about the psychosexual interview? Was he worried about something else? Is he ashamed? Imagine the sexual issues that Josh had, having in essence been sexually abused by Stephen. At the very least, we know that he was exposed to porn as a child. I think it was quite extensive. And God knows what Stephen talked about in front of Josh. And also Stephen was extremely abusive to everyone, and particularly to Josh. And then as an adult, Josh was aversive to touch and sex. So this test might have been challenging him in a number of ways. But one of the ways which we could speculate is that he might have worried that the polygraph would reveal things about Susan Powell's disappearance, which would implicate him and open up a whole can of worms, because that would be relevant to that test, to ask him directly questions about Susan's disappearance, because that is relevant to his parenting capacity and safety, right? But we don't know. We don't know what Josh was thinking. But one of the things that I've been doing throughout this deep dive, because I've been obsessed on this case, is I've been really trying to enter his mind. I feel like I'm one of those tropes that you'll see where the police officer is investigating a crime and they're trying to catch a criminal, and they enter the mindscape of the psychopath and they become a psychopath themselves. I feel like I'm halfway there. Because of all the reporting, it's all from journalists, and there's been some fantastic journalism, particularly from Dave Cawley of the Cold podcast. It's just a superb example of journalism, because he actually goes to the sources. He actually managed to get to sources that were never questioned by the police or the press. He discovered new data. There's just a lot of things about that podcast and that journalism that is just top notch. And I worry that he's a dying breed on some level, but I don't know. But I don't know of anybody who is from my neck of the woods, my profession, that has really absorbed everything and tried to figure out why Josh did what he did, which I'll give my final thoughts in a future chapter. But I think that given what I know about Josh, I think he considered 5 different options. 1, try to get out of the psychosexual evaluation somehow. And I'm guessing that he thought maybe I get a lawyer, or I say, how dare you, or those aren't my images, something along those lines. I'm guessing he considered that, but he probably thought that wouldn't work. 2, I think he probably considered trying to trick the evaluation, the polygraph and the plethysmograph, but it's hard to do that. I think he also considered running away and just heading for the border or something, but he doesn't have any experience with that. Number 4, I think he might have contemplated facing the music. I don't think he would have considered that very long, given everything that he's been doing and given the consequences and given the way Stephen raised him. And then number 5, I think he considered killing himself. He's been thinking about suicide, I think, since he was a kid. I don't know how often, but he did attempt when he was a teenager, and he fits the profile of someone who would think about suicide, given the tremendous amount of abuse he was going through and the family turmoil that was going on throughout his childhood, particularly as a teenager, and the fact that he never really developed any kind of even moderately close relationships with anybody. You know, we have this thing called thwarting belongingness in our field that is a major factor found in suicide thoughts and attempts and completions, meaning that when people feel like they're trying to belong and they feel thwarted. Now, many people, including Josh, are not actually being thwarted, or they're being thwarted because of their behavior. So it's not like they're being bullied. And he was bullied as well, seemingly, in his late teens. I don't know if that was his fault, meaning that he caused people to stand up for themselves and that he framed that as bullying. I don't know. But I think that there's a good chance that he, when he attempted, that didn't end his thoughts about suicide, because he didn't get any treatment, or there doesn't seem to be any evidence of healing after he was a teenager. So whatever led to him attempting seriously in his teenage years, those factors probably only got worse as time went on, particularly as his marriage was falling apart with Susan, right? So I think that he had already been considering that, and then when the psychosexual evaluation is impending, it's on the horizon, I think he said, that's it. I've been thinking about this. There were probably moments during the investigation over the last couple of years where it looked like he might be charged or caught, and maybe even the night or the day after Susan disappears, the cops are in his house. I wouldn't be surprised if he was thinking about it then. Now, normally we have sympathy for people who think about suicide, right? Because they're often suffering and it's unfair. And Josh was suffering and it was unfair when he was a kid, but he's going through a lot of suffering since he killed Susan, and he deserves to suffer because of what he did, right? So I'm not saying that you're supposed to have sympathy for him, but I think that this is something that is often not highlighted enough. Usually when you have a murder-suicide, a family annihilator, they focus on the murders, which of course should be focused on, but I think it begins with a suicide. Like even with people like Elliot Rodger and other kinds of mass shooters, I think the problem begins with suicidal thoughts. And then they think, okay, if I'm going to die, I might as well take people with me because I'm so angry, or something like that. And if we, in my opinion, focus on preventing those suicidal thoughts, I think we could prevent the murders as well. Not because retroactively we feel bad for people like Josh, but because we want to prevent people like Charlie and Braden being murdered. So I'm guessing along those lines, after he had decided, okay, that's it, I'm just going to kill myself, I've been thinking about it on and off. I don't like my life. I never really have. I have no prospects. I didn't get the life insurance money. I'm a failure in life. I've always felt worthless throughout my life because of the way that my dad treated me. I'm about to be thrown in jail. Let's just end this. I'm guessing that a short time later, he decided he was going to kill his two boys, Charlie and Braden. And we just have to ask ourselves why, right? Is it that he had that narcissistic notion of, if I can't have them because I'll be dead, then no one can have them? Or the narcissistic notion of, these are my things, my kids, so I'm just going to bring him with me, as if he would bring like a toy with him that's his? Is it that he didn't want Susan's parents to have the kids because that would be that's where they were placed with? They were in Susan's parents, the Coxes, in their home. And there was a lot of fighting going on between Josh and Stephen, particularly between Stephen and the Coxes. So you imagine that Josh, and I mean, we know that Stephen hated the Coxes. I'm guessing Josh also did as well. So maybe he's like, I want to hurt them, and so I can hurt them through the kids. That does happen. There's many cases of that. The other thing I wonder about was the seed of this decision planted all the way back on Monday of December 7th, 2009, when he's already killed Susan. He has stashed the body somewhere. The police are calling, his family is calling that morning, and he's like, how come everyone's calling me already? I thought I had time. Oh no. And he's not home, and they're saying, you got to come home. You got to come home. And he is delaying for some reason. And it doesn't seem to be related to him trying to cover up the crime. It kind of seems like he's panicking and he just doesn't want to face the music. At that point, again, if we enter into his mind, what was going on in his mind? We have a similar case with O.J. Simpson, who, when the walls were closing in on him after Nicole Brown and Ronald Goldman were found dead, and O.J. Simpson gets in his white Bronco and says, I'm going to kill myself, right? And he seemed pretty close to killing himself. He had a gun, he's crying, he's saying, I'm sorry. And, that went on for a while. So it's a known response for criminals like this to go into a state where they just don't want to be caught. They'll do anything to avoid being caught, including killing themselves. So it's not hard to believe that, given that Josh had already attempted seriously when he was a teenager, and typically if there's a major attempt in the past, it's predictive of future thoughts and attempts. Having attempted in the past is one of the most predictive factors of predicting in the future. It's not a slam dunk indication, of course, but it's one of the factors that I tell my supervisees to pay attention to. If they have a client that is thinking about suicide, one of the major questions that they need to know is, has their client attempted in the past? Because if they have, then it raises the risks. Other risks, while I'm on this topic, are having a gun at home and drinking alcohol. I'd have to look at my notes and the research, but those are the main ones that come to mind. Anyway, so for Josh, on December 7th, that Monday, he's dilly-dallying, delaying coming home. Was he thinking about killing himself? And he has the kids with him. And was he thinking, I'll just kill myself and I'll kill the kids too? I don't know. It's a lot of speculation, but maybe that seed that was planted then would be occasionally nurtured as the ebbs and flows of the case was happening over the next couple of years. As the tension would rise, like, oh my God, I'm gonna get caught. Was he like, okay, I'm gonna kill myself and the kids? And then it would start to die down. You'd be like, okay, I'm not gonna do that. I don't know. Typically, that's what will happen. Typically, when people kill themselves or when they take drastic measures along these lines, murder included, there's typically a buildup to it. Some people impulsively will do stuff like this, and those are scary cases because it's like, how do you prevent that? But more often than not, people have been thinking about something. So it's speculative, but it just makes me wonder. And through this speculation, I think it might help us all to keep these things in mind as we try to prevent these things from happening in the future. That's what I'm concerned about as a clinician, professor, supervisor. I'm concerned about these things happening again because they will happen again. There are thousands of Joshes across the United States right now who are on a road to doing this. Most will not do it, but some will. How do we catch those cases? What are the signs? What do we do to prevent this? I think understanding the mind of the individual is a major component of prevention. Another question that I have is how he was dealing emotionally and psychologically with the press and the internet. You know, he probably was aware of the discussions online and the opinions in the press because it was almost universal that everyone was sure that he had killed Susan, that he was a monster and a terrible parent. And you got to figure when he's walking around in public, he's assuming everyone hates him. So what kind of toll does that take on someone? And, you know, we don't typically think about that. I'm not saying we're supposed to care about Josh, but just to understand his mind, I think it is something that would have taken a toll. Why wouldn't it have taken a toll? And I'm wondering if the motivation to kill his kids might have been affected by his opposition and his anger and rage at the public and the internet. I'm not saying the internet is to blame, but it does make me wonder, was he saying, I'm going to kill these kids because I'll show you it's my one last thing that I can do to punish the world? You know, it's twisted, but to these individuals, sometimes those things make sense to them. Either way, screw people like this. You know, if I could go back in time and talk to Josh and just say, look, if you're going to kill yourself, fine, but don't take others with you. Just don't. All right, so let's take a break, but the rest of this episode will just be for patrons of the podcast. There's actually a lot to get into. There's the actual murder-suicide, which I'm going to go over again. I went over it in chapter 1, but there's other details that are, you know, really interesting, like Josh called his sister, and we have a recording of that. He called her just before he killed himself. There's also the recording of the 911 call, and it's a very frustrating call, which I can't wait to process with you because the first time I heard it, it enraged me. There's a lot of other videos that we can watch. Also, there's a tremendous amount of aftermath after this. There's the trial for Susan Powell. There's all the legal actions that the Coxes took regarding fighting with the police and DSHS and other people. So there's a lot to get into, and the rest of this will be for patrons, and I'm looking forward to getting into this. The next chapter will be me going into the conceptualizations of Josh and Stephen, which should be the final bit of this deep dive. So if you want to hear the rest of this episode, become a patron. Otherwise, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.